visual quality that is going to follow in the show. So we have a lot of things to do, and also to hook an audience into watching the show.
Well, it had the feeling like a Saturday afternoon serial. That was a thing. You know, when you were a kid, you used to go and do the cliffhanger. You know, Captain Marvel and Don Winslow and Dick Tracy, and you'd see 20 minutes, and then they'd end on some kind of big impact. Well, the $6 Million Man had that feeling, so it brought a very young audience to television, and they got that Saturday afternoon matinee feeling about it.
I was approached by Frank Price, who was executive vice president of Universal at that time. And Frank and I had developed a very strong relationship because I did Ironsides and The Name of the Game, and the openings were so successful that Frank usually called me when they had something major in the way of an opening sequence that they wanted to solve. So Frank introduced me to Harv Bennett, and Harv and I talked a while, and we screened, I think it was the pilot movie. I think $6 Million Man came out as a TV movie first rather than just a pilot. And we screened it, talked about it. Harv said he'd like to be able to tell the story, the backstory of the $6 Million Man.
In going to series, I knew we needed an opening which did several things. Number one, it had to reprise the story of the original movie and of Martin Caidin's book. Number two, it had to set the tone of an action-adventure show so that people would stay with us through tonight's episode.
Energy. I mean, Harv was the energy behind the show. I mean, besides being a writer and creator, he's just a terrific, terrific producer. Very, very calm, but knew how to get the best out of everybody on that crew. Richard Anderson was just, he's terrific. He cared about that show. If anybody was a $6 Million Man, that was Richard. He loved his job. He loved his character.
I thought Richard did a hell of a job with that opening, you know, and the visuals were very exciting. And this was done before special effects were really into it. Today, you know, they might do it in a different way, but at that time, special effects were kind of new 35 years ago. I just loved it. I thought they were terrific.
This was before Google. This was before Apple even existed as a company. This is before Microsoft existed. Computers were nothing more than a hobby item for a couple of nerds, and basically regular people hadn't even heard of home computing. So with that context in mind, I had to create what became a world that made more sense existing today with what we know. And I did that by this show over and over again, and still discover something new in the opening sequence. So I had no less than 4 or 5 layers of images going on simultaneously.
Back in, when we first started the television series, there weren't digital effects at the time. They didn't exist. All of the stunts were done live on camera, either reversed or slow motion, high-speed photography. Nothing like you could do now. But and we had those.
Of course, the hallmark of the show is narrated by Richard Anderson, with one exception. We needed a line after Richard recorded, and I wrote the line, and I couldn't find Richard, so I did it myself. Did a lot of voiceovers on the show, just for fun. The line is, Steve Austin. Astronaut.
A man barely alive.
A man barely alive. That's me.
Harv Bennett wrote basically the narration, the backstory narration. Steve Austin, Man Barely Alive, that kind of stuff. But when it came to selling the crash, Harv's voiceover never took that into consideration. So I had to sell at the point of the highest tension. I came up. I don't know where it came from, but I had Steve ad-lib part of the crash sequence. Now I wanted to sell the idea that Steve was in the same timeline and responding to this real voice. And so, where everything was done with filtration at that time, I decided to mic a gas mask or a flight oxygen mask and put the mic at the end of it and had him read his lines into it, so he had the same kind of squeeze and static that the control tower had, and it sold the idea that Steve was talking to this particular controller.
The really iconic thing about that opening sequence is that it compresses the entire history of this man's life, from tragedy to rebirth. You have this, this opportunity, a really seductive opportunity to take technology and update your failed human existence. He crashed, tumble, and kaboom, it's like, that's it. It'd be over for most people, but, not for the $6 million man, for a modest investment for the government, he gets to, update all of his important physical abilities.
First of all, I had to research what actually happened to Peterson. And I found out that while coming in, the landing body dropped from an airplane, gliding to space. As he was coming in for a landing, a normal, perfect approach, a press helicopter crossed his path inadvertently, causing him to move the joystick just enough to avoid the helicopter, and he lost control and tumbled, and all that you see actually was the frightening crash. I met Mr. Peterson, or Colonel Peterson, later. He was the bionic man. He had prosthetics and he had a voice device, and it was frightening when you first met him because he sounded artificial, but he was a remarkable officer and a true hero. So we wanted to reflect that in the main title. I think we achieved that.
The center piece of the opening was the crash. And Steve Austin, as a test pilot, crashes and destroys large parts of his body. And this was the center piece of the film. Now, we couldn't recreate that. So I was able to get that footage from NASA, which was an actual test vehicle that had crashed. And around that, I was going to use audio as well as video to really be exciting and authentic. The images I used were audio heartbeats and at the same time blips from an encephalograph machine, and I used multiple lights that would go on and off. I would use numbers that kept rotating. It looked like it was created by computer and that the pieces of it would have been made by a computer. The interesting thing is that we also had to create what is bionics, because prior to that, bionics was not an everyday word. And so I had to create a part that replaced the human body. And I staged the operation, and funny enough, for the leg, for the bionic leg, we used the leg that was made for Clint Eastwood in a film I think was called Beguiled, where he played a Civil War soldier who sort of was kept prisoner by a bunch of women during Civil War times and had a leg amputated in it. Well, that was the leg we found. We cut a window opening into the leg and started stuffing printed circuits into it until it had the feeling of a true robotic piece with skin, artificial skin covering it. So I was in the, we ran out of people for the operation, so I became the hands that handed the leg of the Bionic Man running. And what I did was I put two separate speeds together to create a kind of unreal sense of speed. He was going in slow motion, but the images were passing in very fast motion. So it put together and created a very kind of unique feeling to the quality of speed that he could generate bionically, and ended the piece, I guess, with one of the most iconic parts of it is this lens flare and sun blasting through one of his eyes or the edge of his face. And that's how the frame froze that led into the show.
I was a fan, and still am a fan, of NFL films. And as a fan of NFL films, anyone who has ever seen them knows that they shoot at 94 frames a second in order to show great power. Running backs are running very slowly, and as a result, you say, I don't want you running over me. So that be power play. And we did it first in the main title.
Usually, the visuals are done first, so that you are working blind as to what the music ultimately is going to be. In Ironside, Quincy Jones did the theme, and he screened my title sequence and wrote his music to emphasize the title sequence and the visuals. With the $6 Million Man, I don't know where you're heading. Music is the emotion. It's the emotional note and undercurrent of the entire sequence.
It's a piece of television history, and I was part of it. I'm happy to be part of anything that has to do with staying power, and that show really has it.
In looking back at the titles as a whole, my son, who is grown and going to film school at Cal Arts, had a number of friends who were very talented film students, and we were at a party together, and my son mentioned that, oh, my dad did the opening sequence for the $6 Million Man. And I thought it would stop at that point, and all of a sudden, they started bowing down and saying, "You're the man, you're the man." And that's, I guess, the first time I realized that generationally, the titles took on a whole new level of impact to future generations of filmmakers.